We're here today to talk about the Press Gang. With the Press Gang, Seven Stories Press has just released a mammoth collection of film criticism from the New York press days of 1991 to 2011, featuring the talents of Zoller Seitz, Godfrey Cheshire, and Armond White. Now, I had not read a lot of this criticism before, and from reading the introduction and they forward quite lovely pieces of writing in their own right. It's fascinating, the story of how this collection came to be. The source material was gathered from scattered archives, from libraries, from your own personal collections, and kind of cobbled together because there's apparently not a great wealth of this stuff collected that can be handily put out, which in the internet age is crazy to think because everything's backed up now, but you are talking about the early 90s up through the early 2000s. So I wanted to start off by asking, when you were all approached about going back to contribute pieces to this book, did you reread all of your essays and criticisms before kind of signing off on them, or did you just kind of hand them over? And if you did go back and read a lot of them, what was your reaction to looking at this stuff from a couple decades ago, especially compared to how you feel you've developed as writers and thinkers today?
As the youngest of the three at the time, and still, I guess, I really dreaded going back and reading what I wrote during those years, because I like to think that I'm better all around than I was then. But I was pleasantly surprised, and I guess my general reaction was, for a kid who didn't know shit, he wrote pretty well. That was my take on it, and I do think a lot of the takes held up. I was in, like Godfrey and Armond as well. I was often in the position of writing the only piece of praise for a movie that everyone else in town hated, or the only pan of what everybody else in town loved. And there's always an intermediate period for me when I get a few years out from that and the consensus is still hardened, and I think, like, I wonder if I got that wrong. Like, I think it's ordinary to have doubts about stuff, and then usually what would happen is a few years later the consensus would shift to more of what I said back then, and I was like, thank God. Because it actually matters to me. Like, I don't want to be egregiously wrong or stupid in my opinion on a movie. I know it's subjective, but there are some takes that I believe are objectively wrong. And I don't think I had as many of those as I feared.
Real quick on that, though, the takes that you think are objectively wrong, whether they're coming from you or from other people, do you find that this kind of gets into the idea of troll criticism, sort of, being the contrarian to, be the person who stands out among a sea of critics? And I'm not accusing you of that by any stretch, but when you are out there on that island alone saying, no, this was terrible, or no, this was great, or you hear that from someone else, do you feel that there is room to make that compelling argument, or are you open to hearing compelling arguments from people? How easy is it to write off something as trolling versus it's a well-reasoned argument that I just can't get behind?
I'll do a little segue here because I saw Armond stroking his chin, and that's how I know he's ready to enter the ring. But I actually do. I mean, I don't know that I don't believe that there's any such thing as troll criticism from anybody who practices criticism full time. There are people whose takes we may consider to be incorrect, insincere, calculated, whatever. But I don't think anybody who writes about movies, television, music, books, or anything else, like, all the time, is saying things just to be saying them. I mean, you can usually pick up pretty quickly who believes what they say and who doesn't. It's only a question of whether you agree with it. But I actually appreciate, some reviews that a lot of people would consider to be trolling. And one quick example is Roger Ebert's review of Blue Velvet, which is a film I think is a great film and an important film. But there's one part of the review where he chastises David Lynch for the scene where Isabella Rossellini emerges from the rose bushes naked. And he says that in his opinion, the film, it was such a powerful, upsetting, real image in an otherwise kind of fantastic fairy tale context that he didn't feel like the movie did enough to justify it. And he felt like the actress was being put on display for no good reason. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but that statement is lodged in the back of my mind, and it's been there for almost 30 years now, which tells me that maybe he was onto something. And that's the kind of thing, like, and people consider that review to be kind of a trolling review, but I think it's important to have at least one person out there who's questioning certain parts of movies that everyone else has agreed are masterpieces. And I'm sure Armond would agree with that.
Well, okay, I have stroked my beard now, so I'll say when I wrote the pieces at New York Press, I thought hard about everything before I committed it to print, before I let the public see it. I thought about it, and so when I went back to it, nothing has changed, and I'm grateful that I was able to say whatever I said as well as I said it. Very rarely do I change the point of view that I've written about something, because I do think hard about it, and I'm not going to write something if I don't mean it. I intend to say what I mean in print, and let that stand forever. You know, to answer your question, I thought, well, I still feel that way, and I'm glad I said it then.
I got to say, one of the things that surprised me, and I figured this out about you a few years ago, Armond. I first heard about you through Rotten Tomatoes and the sort of reputation that you had gotten back in the day for being the critic who liked to be contrarian for the point, just for the sake of being contrarian, for knocking those perfect scores down, you know, a couple of notches on the tomato meter or whatever. And I was drawn to your work because when everyone's saying, you know, run away from this guy, I immediately say, okay, what does he have to say? He can't, you know, just be all bad. He's been around for a long time. So I started reading your work, and I've got to say, you do put forth a lot of well-reasoned arguments, and the conviction is there. And one of the things I love about this book is the writing is longer form than we tend to see now, especially with a lot of internet criticism. And you really get a sense for a point of view. The ideas have time to breathe. And I don't think anybody can read any of the criticisms or the essays in this book and come away with the idea of, oh, these people don't know what they're talking about. They don't care. They're just trying to write to, you know, for clicks or whatever, even though there weren't clicks back then. So that's why I like this discussion of trolling, because Matt, yeah, I don't quite believe in trolling, at least in terms of, as you put it, what professional critics do. I think there are, you know, some folks who are internet critics, but not necessarily the ones who take it very seriously, who just like to come in and dive bomb things for the sake of doing it. I've been accused of that myself, and it hurts because the sincerity of your convictions doesn't always come across, or, you know, it can be seen as just, you know, an exercise, but, you know, I think the heart is often there.
Let me also add, I saw Matt on a public, I think it was a public television TV show several years ago. I can't remember the name of it, but it was a program about journalism. You remember that, Matt?
Vaguely.
And there was a teacher, a journalism teacher on that program whose name I don't remember either, but he said something that stuck with me. And he said that in journalism, you can't say everything you know. And this is true. And so when I do reread pieces I've written, I always see places where I wish I had added to it.
Oh, yes.
More. But as that guy on the program that you participated in, Matt, as you said, you can't say everything you know.
No.
You try to say what's important. You try to say what you really truly mean and what you think people need to know about a particular film. So that's part of the process. And I think it's part of the process that perhaps all these years after New York Press, that some readers may not be accustomed to. I think that's where the idea of trolling comes up, that they don't understand that most writers try to say what they truly mean, that they're not just doing it for effect.
True.
Can I jump in here?
Yes, please.
Well, when Jim Colville came to me with the idea of this book, I was very, very pleased with the idea. I thought that it could make a very interesting book, and I want to mention him because I think we all owe a great debt to him. This was a tremendous amount of work on his part. It was his vision. And it was interesting to me to go back and look at my pieces that I hadn't read in a very long time in most cases, that I wasn't scared as Matt was. I was intrigued, and I was very happy to be as pleased as I was with most of what I read. I felt like when I came to New York in 1991 and got the job with New York Press, I've been writing in North Carolina for over a decade, and I think I was really up to speed as far as my writing abilities were concerned. But the main thing was being here and having the complete freedom to write about what I wanted to write about and at whatever length at New York Press, and especially to write for the audience in Manhattan, which I thought was maybe the best, most film literate audience in this country, was really inspiring. And I hope that sort of comes across in the writing that you see there. I will say that when I look back on the choices that Jim made, it strikes me that, I mean, I agree with pretty much everything. I wish the book could have been twice as long, but it's very long already. But the choices that he made, I think, were very much ones that I applaud. And I see in my own stuff that in reviews, he tends to choose the ones that are very positive and very negative, or very negative. It strikes writing as strongest. The opinions are most sort of engaging in those pieces. But, the word trolling is really not in my vocabulary. This is after my time in writing for a publication like New York Press. I have a hard time applying it to the criticism that I value and the criticism that I practice. But I was struck in looking at the pieces, the negative pieces of mine, that I don't consider myself a contrarian, but I panned movies like Boogie Nights and like Unforgiven and Fargo and some other movies that were enormously popular with critics. And I wasn't writing against other critics. I was writing against what I saw on the screen. And so I'm very happy with those reviews. I don't care if nobody agrees with them at this point at all. And by the same token, I'm still very pleased with the raise I gave to movies like Thin Red Line and Amistad and Nixon and The Age of Innocence and some others. So The Player, it was a great era for movies, and I think that's one reason that this book will be of interest to cinephiles now.
One thing I do want to ask, because I'm glad you brought up the Boogie Nights review, because it is in there that you made a dig. I think it was at Owen Gleiberman talking about you must have been slack-jawed with festival fever. When you wrote things like that, and then Matt, when you wrote your legendary review of Sphere, in which you accused the actors in that film of being literal money whores.
Yeah.
A couple of things. One,
I can't go back in time and not write it, so yeah. Yeah, well, I said it.
Sure, but I guess my question for both of you, and Armond, jump in here as well. Did any of that stuff ever carry off the page in terms of like running into folks either at festivals or just kind of press mixers? And did you ever have words with people, or was it the back and forth just limited to the pages?
Well, I can give you one specific example of when that did happen to me, and there were others, and I'm sure there were for Armond and Godfrey. It was around about 2000. I wrote a piece about, it was combining reviews of 3 current Miramax films. I don't remember what they all were, but I think one of them might have been Casanova, if that was the year when it came out. But it was about the idea that Miramax had started out as being one of the signature importers of significant foreign films and had later shifted over into producing fake versions of foreign films aimed at American audiences, specifically Oscar voters. And it was the idea of Miramax as the manufacturer of faux foreign films. And after that piece ran, a couple of days later, I got a call from somebody who was the head of publicity at Miramax at the time. They wanted to have lunch with me. And I said, what about? And they're like, oh, I just wanted to talk to you about your work in general. It turns out it was almost like a weird kind of, I don't know if I would call it a warning exactly, but it was like him trying to explain to me that why everything that Miramax was putting out was actually very sincerely meant, and there was no sort of marketplace calculation, and he thought that piece was unfair, and he didn't think that I had put much thought into it before I made those accusations and all this. And I was like, can we skip ahead to the part where you tell me if I'm not going to be invited to screenings anymore? Because if that's, like, is there an implied threat here? And he's like, oh, no. But I could tell that it was an attempt to influence me against writing a piece like that in the future. And then there were times when I just ran into people at parties, like, I didn't know they were going to be there, and they were mad at me. Like Todd Solondz is still mad at me because I panned Happiness.
Wow. That was quite a while ago.
It was. I got invited to moderate a panel for I think it was Life During Wartime, the sequel. And somebody else fell out at the last minute and they asked me, and I said, I'll do it with the understanding that he probably reads his clips and he knows that I was mixed on Welcome to the Dollhouse and I hated Happiness. And he's like, I'm sure it won't be a problem. And it ended up that when I got on that stage, Todd Solondz turned to me right when the Q&A began. He said, I must say, I'm a little surprised to see you here considering that you panned Happiness. And I'm like, okay. And he said, you didn't just pan it, you devastated it. You said it was the work of a high school mentality. I was like, oh my God. I don't remember saying that, but yeah, I'm sure I did. But then it was fine. And we actually argued about that review, but that happens.
Matt,
But it was the
this is
work
the
of a high school
review of
mentality. He got better.
We did get better. See? And that was my thing was I thought Life During Wartime felt like a second pass at the same material.
Sure.
Right. Matt, isn't the review of Happiness in the book my review?
It is.
Where did you review?
It was for the Independent Weekly, North Carolina.
Yeah, a gig that I got you, I guess.
Yes, it was.
I don't know why they wouldn't have used.
Belatedly, thank you.
Right. Well, I was more mixed or positive on Happiness. I wrote a review that I think was trying to appreciate what was interesting and good about that movie without giving it full credit, because I did think it had some problems. But as far as Miramax goes, I have a story that very similar to yours, Matt, that I think predates yours, because mine was in early 1995 when Miramax put out Kurosawa's Through the Olive Trees, and they basically just dumped it. They just put it out with like one very abrupt press screening, no advertising, one theater downtown. And I wrote a column that was really talking about what Miramax was doing overall, putting a lot of money into aiming at the Oscars. There was a second tier of things where they were movies like some Bullets Over Broadway by Woody Allen, where they were putting some effort into it, but not going whole hog. And then there were other things like Through the Olive Trees that they're just tossing out there. And if they stuck for some reason, great. But if not, too bad. And I wrote about that, and somebody said you could hear the Diet Pepsi cans hitting the wall in Tribeca when Harvey read that. And they called me, and they had me out to Nobu for lunch and all of that. And, I thought it was smart of them to be diplomatic rather than confrontational or something, but it didn't change my mind. But I read afterwards, one sort of prominent indie director in the preface to his screenplay said he backed off from a Miramax deal after he read that. He thought this was the first piece that was really critical of Miramax's whole operation that anyone wrote that he knew of, and that it opened the door to other people looking at Miramax more critically.
The pressure from studios to kind of make sure that their messages, everything is sort of on brand, especially with the people who are covering it. Do you find that that's still the case today? Or do you receive kind of intimidations or friendly suggestions or nudges in one direction or other from studios to give positive coverage? I've heard stories about, or speculation from people who aren't film critics, that if critics give a bad rating to a film, then they'll be disinvited from press junkets. I've never, or press screenings rather. I've never known that to be the case. I've always seen the model of any publicity is good publicity. So I just wanted to know, have you seen any cases where that's actually happened?
It's happened to me, and it's once or twice, and it's happened to Armond a lot, I think. Right?
Yeah.
Is this?
Yeah, so, well, to that I would say, the two, I guess, most infamous incidents are Spike Lee and Noah Baumbach, and maybe because of that outrageous behavior, maybe other publicists have not tried it. So usually I almost never have. I've only ever had problems in those two cases, which those two cases I guess deserve to be known because they were so egregious. But generally, I have not found any intimidation coming from publicists. Maybe because they know it won't work, or maybe because I will say that a good publicist is a professional publicist knows better. A professional publicist will also respect a serious critic, which we all were trying to be, and not interfere. And in my experience also, I would say the same for the better filmmakers. I've only gotten responses, I've only gotten positive responses from better filmmakers. I have certainly gotten negative responses from filmmakers who I think should not even be in the profession. And that's okay with me. As long, you know, the filmmakers I respect, if they appreciate what I was saying, that's good enough for me. The filmmakers whose work I don't care for, if they didn't like it, that's tough.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I've had filmmakers, actors, and screenwriters tell me, it doesn't happen often, but I've had them tell me that a pan that I wrote of something that they were involved in was actually accurate, that it reflected their own feelings. And most recently, it happened about a year ago when I panned, you know, my other job as a television critic, I panned a pretty big new Amazon show that had just gone up. And the lead actor phoned me at the office and told me, look, this is off the record, but, you know, that show was a disaster from the beginning, and everything you said in there, I think, reflects how I felt about the experience. And I wouldn't be going back if I hadn't just bought a new house. So, you know, I mean, there may be less, I don't know. I think there are honest people in the industry. And also, just because you don't agree, you know, if somebody loves something that they did and you say something negative about it, like the really, really, really mature and self-confident artists won't be mad at you. And, yeah. You know, and also another thing related to this, which I think is important, is especially now, I think the pressure has actually gotten worse now because things are click-based, and also journalism, as we once knew it, has been almost completely destroyed. And so it used to be that the institution that employed you carried a certain weight, and that weight could be used as a shield between you and the studio, the network, what the DVD company, you know, the streaming platform, whoever it was. That's not the case anymore. Most of these people are freelancers. If they're lucky, they're contract freelancers, and they're out there flying totally exposed. And I'll tell you one thing I do hate is when I see some multimillionaire entertainer get on Twitter and attack some critic because of something negative that they wrote. To me, that has always been poor form, but now I see it as a form of bullying, because we're talking about somebody who may have dictated this to their personal assistant while they're riding in the back of the limousine, and they're attacking somebody who filed their own review while they're waiting for their laundry to dry. And they don't even write for a living because it's very hard to do that these days. They probably have some other job, and they're doing it only out of love. So to me, it's like, it's no different than berating the waiter who brings your food too late, you know, for an entertainer to do that. Like, they all need to grow spines and thicker skin.
Well, and this was, you know, that's a little bit different than what I was asking, but it's great insight. And I wonder how this is related, because you're talking more about talent, I think. I was wondering more at the studio level, if there's any kind of pressure, but it sounds like the interactions that you've had, like with that person on the Amazon show, which turned out positive. But Armond, I'm not quite familiar with the Noah Baumbach, Spike Lee situation. Was that reviews, or was that an interview that you had with them that kind of got you on their their naughty list? What happened there?
Oh, well, in both cases, it was simply a matter that they didn't like the reviews I had written. And so they had their publicists disinvite me to a screening of their latest product. And, you know, by the way, you know, in the case of Noah Baumbach, I had told a friend about it, and a friend is the one who mentioned it on the internet, and that's how word got out about it over the film Greenberg. And so that became a big issue at the time, but that's where it stemmed from. In that case, another form of bullying, to use that term. These filmmakers feel that critics don't have the right to express their opinion, and so they don't want them to see their new film as if that's going to stop me, as if I couldn't buy a ticket and then write the review as well. So when a critic is not invited to screenings, that's just a show of disrespect, either personal disrespect or disrespect for the profession itself. And those are the two occasions where it's happened. Although it happened several occasions with Spike Lee, only one occasion with Noah Baumbach, but that was probably the most infamous example. But
I do think that, you know, to go back to the original intent of your question, I think I wouldn't say that there is more pressure from studios or from, whoever the content holder is. It's all one big content stream now. It's more that they have found ways, because of the click-based internet economy and these algorithms that guide you to things that you already know that you like. It has become it was never easy to write and sell a piece about an old movie or about a retrospective or a box set of some obscure, to most Americans, filmmaker. But basically now we're in a situation where not only can you not sell anything that's about old stuff, except to a handful of outlets, one of which is RogerEbert.com, which I'm one of the editors at. But also increasingly editors are a little bit more reluctant to assign anything that doesn't have to do with subjects that they already know are popular with readers. So discovery, the critics who specialize in discovery, I and other people have called truffle hunters. I think the most valuable critics out there are what you call the truffle hunters. They're out there rooting around on the forest floor trying to find the truffles that are hidden. And they're not concentrating on, the mighty oaks that everyone can already see. And Godfrey and Armond and I know we all made our attempts to do that. And we'd often give the lead review position within our column if we wrote about more than one movie. I loved it. I was never happier when I would open the paper and I would see that all three of us had led with some movie that most people never even knew existed. And then buried at the bottom, there's 3 paragraphs on the new, Star Wars movie.
Yeah.
And I thought that was great. And Jonathan Rosenbaum used to do that at the Chicago Reader. I remember, I'll never forget one time he gave like 2,000 words to the documentary, The Panama Deception. And at the bottom of it was a review of Deep Cover, which was a positive review. And he actually tied the two films together through Manuel Noriega. But I love that, like, the studio film got second place. And I think we should have the ability to do that. And that's not how things are assigned. And also, so many websites now are basically, most of their clicks are being generated by superheroes, Star Wars, Pixar, DC Comics, and a handful of other massive properties that they already know are popular. And as a result, if you try to go in there and write about anything that's off the beaten track from those 4 subjects, even if it's an art house favorite, like somebody like Tarantino or the Coen brothers or someone who's well established, they'll run those pieces, but they're going to be running 13 pieces on the new Batmobile. And they invite critics out to see the unveiling of the new Batmobile. They fly them out, they put them in hotels, and the coverage is guaranteed. And the junkets were, a thing even before the internet kind of subsumed journalism. But I think now the relationship, Armond wrote about this. He wrote about this in this piece called Their Souls for a Freebie. And that was about DVD screeners, which is now, that's ancient history. We might as well be talking about stone tablets. But the idea was the same. The idea was that when we become reliant on the studios for our very existence in some way, we're giving away our autonomy to them, and that's bad. And we're kind of in a way becoming like almost adjunct PR people. And that's what's happened with what I call the superhero industrial complex. It's really shameful. Even people that I respect who run websites that are very eclectic, they have to kind of bow before the tentpole intellectual property stuff, the monster movies and films where robots beat each other up and stuff with superheroes. And I love those kind of films. They're genre films. All 3 of us love those kind of films, but they've crowded out everything else. And I think the critics have gotten pulled into that somehow.
I think at New York Press, during the time that we were writing there, we had an audience that wanted to be told about these more obscure things, the things that they might not have heard about otherwise, that were playing at small downtown art houses. And I think that was what they were looking for. I think that our publishers and editors really understood that, whereas now I think publishers feel the pressure to just go after the things that are already established, as Matt was saying. But it really does depend ultimately on the audience, and I was very appreciative of the audience that we had, because I would just, I'd be standing on the street and somebody would come up to me and quote part of a review I'd written, and I was just kind of blown away by how engaged a lot of these readers were, and that was a thing that was very inspiring to me.
Well, in this landscape, where the popular movies are the comics, the adaptations, like everything is properties now. They don't even talk about barely movies as franchises now, that they're properties, right? Do you feel the pressure to keep up, or do you find that you still are able to carve out time to pursue the passions which are off the beaten path? And how do you, maintain a living doing that?
I do 9 things at once. That's the only way to do it. I tell my journalism students, like, if you're thinking about getting into criticism as a profession, just disabuse yourself of any idea that it's possible. It's not even possible for me. I mean, I think there's a perception that I'm one of the more successful ones, and it's only because I have 2 day jobs. I put out 2 books a year. I teach a class. I run a festival, and I do a bunch of other things. And all of us are that way. And even, people who have bylines at the Times, like, half their income comes from teaching in a lot of cases. Like, it's just a different landscape. And I don't even know if that was your question, but.
No, it's an answer to it is in there, but it raises sort of a lot of questions. When do you see this change as having happened? I mean, maybe it was always this way, but I feel like film criticism as a profession at one time had to have been a real thing, or was it always sort of a part-time passion that some people were able to get paid for?
The beginning of the end was in approximately 2000, when a lot of newspapers, including New York Press and the Star Ledger, where I wrote television criticism, got a website. And they bought into this lie that you put your content up for free and you could monetize it with ads. And we now know that doesn't really work. And
Right.
who makes some money is Craigslist, Facebook, and a few other sites that are kind of vacuuming up all the stuff that newspapers used to do. So that was a lie.
Right.
So we gave a lot of tech companies free content in order to build their business and make their investors and their executives very wealthy. That's what we did. And it was a long process. And I think it started around 1998, 2000, somewhere around in there, maybe a little earlier. And it really started to accelerate around the middle of the last decade. And I think the financial crash was when everybody kind of went, holy shit, this is worse than we thought. And I think it's only gotten worse from there. There was a brief recovery for a few years, like right around 2011, 2012, when websites were hiring. But I just think the digital media model is unsustainable for anything that's not breaking news and pieces that are intended to make you angry, like, here's why your favorite band sucks. And then a bunch of people share it and go, I can't believe this guy.
I think that's partly it, Matt. I can point to that period when the Huffington Post began, and people who were not making a profession of writing began to appear on the internet, and to appear with lots of regularity and with some high profiles too. And I think that had a very negative effect on the quality of journalism, and a devastating effect on the profession of film criticism, because then you got the encroachment of people who were not really film critics, people who weren't taking it seriously. And there they were on high profile websites, and they crowded out the serious film critics. So maybe the economic model for internet journalism is not sustainable, but there was something else. I sense another shift happened in the culture that helped to ruin the profession, or at least to shrink it, and take away the integrity of the profession. We were outnumbered by people who simply had an opinion rather than serious criticism.
I'm sure that there will be complaints that this is an elitist point of view, but I do agree with it.
You got it.
And I think related to that is that a lot of the criticism that is being film criticism, television, everything, music, a lot of it is really more like social criticism or editorial writing that happens to use popular culture as the peg. And it's not really discussing the work in any serious, deep way. It's only talking about the messages that it contains and whether they are good or harmful for the culture at large, however that person defines it. And I think there's a lot of great writing in that vein, and I think a lot of it's really interesting, and it's informed my own work, but that is not criticism to me, like in the way that I was taught. I was taught that criticism was considering all the different parts of a work, and you thought about the statement it was making, the values that it contained, moral, political values, all of that was important, but it was not just the what, it was the how. And that's one of the things I'm proudest of when I look over this volume is Armond, Godfrey, and I, we always wrote about the how. Whether it was Godfrey talking about, the misuse or proper use of documentary techniques in the many nonfiction films that he wrote about at great length, probably greater length than anyone else in the country, or Armond talking about how cuts could be political, how editing could be a political statement, how cinematography could be, and using, and not just a highfalutin example, an art house example, but he would write about something like Torque.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he compared Torque to, I believe, early Godard. Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, it's good enough, sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think it was around the year 2000 that this changed, and that's one reason that I think this volume can be very interesting to a lot of people, is that the 1990s was really the last decade of print culture in the United States, something that had been there since the founding of the country, and then all of a sudden after that, it kind of disappeared. But in the 90s, when we were writing for New York Press, there was a New York Press box on the corner of almost every street. There were newsstands that sold all kinds of papers, Village Voice, New York Post, all these things. There was a lot of print journalism at that point, and there was a whole culture around that, and there were readers. I mean, you'd go into a coffee shop and you'd see everybody reading the New York Press right after it came out. And that was something that sustained writers, across the country, not just in New York. I think the figures that came out in the early 2000s after the big change came was that before this happened, there was something like 600 or more people in the United States that were making full-time livings from being film critics. And a few years later, there was something like 60. It just was completely decimated by the change to digital. But I think it does make you appreciate what writers like us were able to do. We were able to make a living, but we also able to give a lot of thought and to give a lot of time to writing these long columns that you don't see anything like that anymore.
A fundamental question is, and I've wrestled with this myself, what do you consider to be a film critic? This goes back to the idea that with the advent of the internet, not only in terms of what it did to people's abilities to make a living off of this, as Godfrey just kind of discussed, but the number of voices that were given to just everyday people to have an opinion on the internet and post it, and hey, I've written a film review, or now I'm a film critic. Is in your estimation, it sounds like collectively there was a downgrade in quality once this kind of sensationalistic mass of people came in to discuss movies and write about them and just get their opinions out there, versus the well-considered sort of long-form film criticism, film journalism that you were doing back in the early 90s and even before that and in through the new decade. Is it that the more amateur voices sort of crowded out the more thoughtful ones because of market needs, or do you think that there was an explosion potentially of good film critics out there who, because they're in this massive sea of opinion with everybody else, we just aren't able to hear from them?
There's some great film critics out there who came up in the post-print journalism era. And not only have I read them, in some cases I've championed them and tried to help them get work that pays. And I know that Godfrey and Armond have always been very good about seeking out and nurturing new voices throughout the decades. So that's something that continues. But I don't think it's more a question of qualifications, because I do agree that it's kind of an elitist presumption to say that, that the three of us are somehow quote unquote qualified to do this and other people aren't. I spent 2 hours the other night talking to a young guy in LA who has never written a piece professionally before, and I've been following him on Twitter. And he tweets about acting, and he tweets about the acting choices of actors who are in films that many would consider to be genre films or not respectable films. And he's talking about the acting choices of people in horror films and science fiction films and action films, and being equally worthy of study as, like, Sir Eddie Redmayne or someone. I don't know if he's really a sir. I use that mockingly. But yeah, that stuff is great. And I don't think it's just a question of like, oh, the great unwashed hordes are coming to take our jobs away. I think it's more that it's hard to separate. It's hard to find and separate out the people who actually have something to say versus the people who are just talking.
But there's a whole lot of people who are just talking, I feel. And I do feel that we were crowded out by hordes of amateurs, frankly. I think what makes a film critic, passion makes a film critic, but most of all, what makes a critic is education, an informed point of view rather than simply a point of view. And that was something that you have to demonstrate with detail. I saw an article just this week about a TV series where the writer said, "Don't sweat the details of this show, just enjoy it." And I think that kind of writing is what the internet specializes in, or that the internet has made constant, and it's everywhere, and that's not real criticism. Of course, people have the right to give their opinion, but just an opinion, I'm not interested in it. And I think one of the blessings of writing at New York Press is that we were able to write what we wrote, and we got responses from people who appreciated the fact that most of what we wrote showed that we were informed writers. We weren't just giving opinion. And I think that is what makes the difference between a critic and somebody who just is interested in movies and has an opinion. I have to say, I think that once the explosion of reviewing happened on the internet, I was appalled to read in our national paper of record someone writing that this is great because the internet has democratized criticism. And I don't think that you can democratize expertise. I think you need to have expertise in order to be a good film critic. And if you don't have it, then it's just an opinion. God bless you, you got an opinion, but that's not criticism. And most of what we are inundated with on the internet is not criticism. I hold to that position.
I had a colleague recently, within the last couple of years, write that it was a tweet, it was a little it was kind of just a side comment, but it was saying like, I don't think it's important how a television show looks, but that's a subject for discussion another time. And I don't know where that they ever actually discussed it, but I was so horrified by that I unfollowed them.
Yeah.
What do you mean it doesn't matter how it looks? What do you mean it doesn't matter that's like saying it doesn't matter how this record sounds.
Right.
You know, like to me, that was like, I can't take anything this person says seriously from this point forward now that they've said that in public.
And I can't help to add to that. I can't help but think that attitude is common, perhaps common now, because real criticism has been pushed aside, or rather has been pushed out of the internet for the most part. I like to think that if people had more examples of real criticism, they'd be embarrassed to say what you just quoted.
Yeah, I think also that in addition to what you said, Armond, about education and informed perspective, that real criticism really is a discipline that takes time to develop. And I think that for most of us, we had writing jobs as critics and journalists that went over a period of years before we got to New York Press. And I felt like that. I felt like if I hadn't had that 10 years in North Carolina where I was writing reviews every week and trying to get better and looking at myself and judging myself and, making a big effort to improve over the years, that I wouldn't have been ready for New York Press. But I think that it's unfortunate now that very few aspiring critics, have the ability to do that, have a kind of a job that they can write every week. I mean, if people do it without any compensation, my hat is off to them. But I think it's hard, and especially people now don't have the kind of space that we had to be able to work out in long form their abilities to really criticize something in depth.
I agree that there does need to be a discipline and a rigor and a commitment to film criticism, to trying to understand film, to try and get better at expressing, one's own reaction to it, and how a particular film or genre of film relates to other examples within its genre, or even other genres. It's a giant tapestry. But where do you see the opportunities for education for people in this digital age where, looking up the history of a movie on Wikipedia can, in some circles count as, being an expert in it? I mean, I think certainly a book like The Press Gang is an excellent example of how to read people who have thought about and artfully expressed their opinions of it. But in terms of just getting an education in film criticism, where does someone start nowadays?
Armond, do you want to start with that?
Well, I'll say I can recommend, because I really don't know how you start nowadays, but I recommend that you start the way I started, which is you start by watching movies, but not only movies. You start by educating yourself about the arts all around. And then the next step is to read, and to read serious critics, not just opinionators, but to read other criticism, to learn how you can express yourself, and to learn to get a sense of the possibilities in the styles and kinds of expression that can be made within this genre of journalism. You start, but you first of all, above all, I would say, to sort of quote D.W. Griffith, above all, you have to see movies, and you have to know something about art. And I hasten to add, not just movies, but you have to know something about art. Otherwise, you're cheating yourself, and you won't have anything to say that anybody else should pay attention to. So you have to get an education in art, and you have to read those two things. You have to read widely, also, not just film criticism, but literary criticism and music criticism and a host of other things.
Yeah, I agree with Armond. I think that seeing movies and getting engaged with movies and trying to look at them from a critical perspective from the time you really get going in that way is the main thing. But beyond that is reading, and reading widely. I agree with Armond that you need to read all different kinds of criticism. But when it comes to film criticism, I think that people have to sort of construct their own education these days. I read a piece in IndieWire just a week or two ago where it was saying, here are the books for any film lover's bookshelf. And I was a little appalled. There was no Andrew Sarris on that bookshelf. There was no American Cinema by Andrew Sarris. There was no Jonathan Rosenbaum. Some of the things that were on there were fine, things that I would put on my list too, but I just deemed that the person that wrote it was young enough not to have really read as widely as she should have in this literature. So it's really up to any aspiring critic or somebody just interested in criticism to go in and look at what's been written that has received the kind of attention and acclaim that has carried it forward in history. There is a lot to read, and I would hope that people would look at our book, The Press Gang, because I think that's a book that should be on people's bookshelves at this point in terms of looking back, especially at the 90s. I think the 90s was a very rich decade, and in terms of, as I mentioned already, the fact that it was the last decade really of print journalism in the United States being a widespread phenomenon. In addition to that, it was the last decade in which movies would be mainly on celluloid. At the end of that decade, we converted to digital projection, digital editing had already come in, everything like that. So the medium changed itself. But the fact that it was the last decade of celluloid, the last decade of print journalism, it was the decade where you had the American independent movement symbolized by Sundance come to the fore, and you had a lot of directors like Spielberg and Scorsese and Terrence Malick and Robert Altman reaching their peaks in their 50s. This makes it a very, very important decade, I think, to the history of cinema, and I really do encourage people to look at our book to see the way that we engaged with it.
I think a couple of the really standout pieces were ones that you, Godfrey, and you, Armond, wrote about the death of cinema, the death of film, and also just looking ahead to the advent of digital projection, and which eventually led to this weird streaming landscape that we're all in. Pandemic aside, there was talk about movie theaters no longer being the preferred venue for seeing films. People get to stream stuff at home, so why go out to the movies? They're expensive. You've got annoying people sitting all around you. Theaters are kind of on the way back. I think people are trying to make that a thing. You had Unhinged last weekend, and you've got Tenet coming out in a couple of weeks. Christopher Nolan is really making a push to get people back into theaters. But I just wonder, in your estimation, what is the future of movies, just as a movie-going experience, quote unquote, and how do you think that will impact film criticism?
I think that we're going to see a boom when the plague ends, and eventually it has to. Every plague ends. But I think it'll be a kind of irrational exuberance. It'll be like a final flowering. And I don't think that movie theaters will ever entirely go away. But as Godfrey wrote in his Death of Film, Decay of Cinema two-parter, movie theaters will increasingly be seen as quote unquote event spaces. And I have a different definition of event than a lot of people do, which is an event is something that shakes me up intellectually, emotionally, morally, makes me question myself, or just makes me feel a kind of ecstatic excitement. And it doesn't have to be a big, loud movie with buildings falling down. But increasingly, that's the only sorts of films that are going to be played in multiplexes, unless it's a dedicated art house cinema, and even those are struggling. And I think we're going to see continue to see movies shown in theaters, and we'll see people lining up to go to them and sit in the dark and watch the movie and have the movie be the thing that they're there for, and not because they can get a burger, which is also becoming more common. And I have a friend who's a bit more of an absolutist than I am. He's a filmmaker about my age, and he said, in my opinion, the decline of theaters began as soon as they offered nachos at the concession stand. And I said, why? And I said, why nachos? And he said, because prior to that, all the snacks that you got were things that you could eat, that you could put in your mouth without looking away from the screen. But when you have to dip the nachos in the cheese, you got to aim right, otherwise you miss the little cheese basket. And I thought that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And then I walked away thinking, I don't know, there's charcuterie platters now, and there's pizza, and there are people bringing you, swordfish sandwiches and stuff. And it's like, and it's great. It's like, okay, if you like that, fine. But I feel like it's a little sad that in order for new chains to succeed, they have to have a full service restaurant and a bar. Like I do. I mean, I know, I guess I'm an old person. I mean, whatever, but I like it when I go to a movie, and the purpose of being in the movie theaters to see a movie. If I'm by myself, to see a movie and sit with the experience. And if it's in a group of people, to talk about the movie later. To me, that's what movie going is. And I do think that it's on its way out. And I think everything goes eventually. I'm glad I came in at the end for what that's worth. It was a great time, but there will be 2 to 3 hour self-contained stories in the future. Most people will watch them at home, on their wall TV, on their laptops, on their phones. Will that be cinema? Not to me. It will be cinematic, but it's not cinema.
It sounds like it'll all just become television again.
Well, that's why we have Godfrey here to tell us about that. He called it, and people were mad about that piece. They were mad about that piece. I had a colleague at the Star Ledger, and when that piece was in the galleys, I said, "Hey, by the way, Godfrey has a piece running in the next issue of New York Press that you're going to want to read, and you might want to respond to it, or because I think it's a major piece of writing, and I still think it's a major piece of writing." And he said, "How would you like it if I called you up and told you what to write about?" I was like, "All right, man." And he thought your piece was completely full of crap, Godfrey. And I was like, now we're 21 years down the line, and like almost everything you said was going to happen happened. The only thing you called wrong was like the exact time frame,
Yeah.
Well, the truth hurts, doesn't it? People can't stand the truth.
Yes.
And anybody who thought that probably had not suffered through Tadpole. And all those films that came from videos that came from that company that called itself Indigent.
Quite a name.
Indigent. And one of the interesting things about the book is that it preserves, in a sense, that period that we suffered through the video transition. But to get back to Ian's question, though, I would say that it's going to change, as Matt indicated. But also, I like to think that the history of cinema, or rather the future of cinema, in part depends on its critics. And it needs critics to remind people of what cinema is, and also to always make a distinction between what's cinematic and what's television and what's streaming, because I believe that there is a difference, and we need critics to make that distinction. And that will help the unknown future be a bit more bearable, I think. And because the future will have to have a place for celluloid projection, for 35 millimeter projection of things like the Magnificent Ambersons. There has to be a place for that, or else the humanities will die.
I agree with Matt about what's going to happen at the sort of the major level of the big event spaces and how they'll be mainly devoted to the big comic book movies that have dominated in recent times. But the thing that worries me or that concerns me is that is the question of what happens to art houses and independent cinemas. I think that this pandemic has hurt them, of course, but it also comes at a time when I think that in a lot of places their returns are going down, mainly because their audience is aging. And, you know, I see this more if I go to North Carolina, where I go to one of the art houses down there. And in fact, their art houses have diminished in number in the last few years. But the ones that are still there, I notice that most people seem to be over 60 or 65. They're scattering younger people, depending on what film that they're showing. But the art house audience, and I think if you asked the people at Sony Classics or other people like that, they would say yes. In fact, Michael Barker from Sony Classics a few years ago says, yeah, art house cinema has about another 10 years to go because the audience is aging out. Hopefully there are new audiences coming along, but I don't think necessarily for these theaters. I taught a course at University of North Carolina a few years ago, and the students in dorms right across the street from the local art house would just not go there. They would just not go there. And I think that this is something that it's a generational change that affects sort of the art house, rituals. The fact that people, in our age group, and even Matt in your age group, a lot of people grew up going to these independent theaters to see, the latest independent film or foreign film or whatever. I think that audience is being diminished. Now, New York, we live in New York. We wrote in New York. That audience will probably always be here to some extent. I'm hoping that the film forums and the IFC centers can survive themselves, but there'll always be the Museum of Modern Art showing Magnificent Ambersons in 35 millimeter. It's more outside of these very main markets that have very big populations that can sustain theaters like this. And even there, I don't know how long they will last. But I do think we're undergoing a sea change that this pandemic has accelerated and accentuated, that these theaters and this part of film culture, which to me is like the key part of film culture, is very much sort of dissolving and going away in the course of history.
Well, Orson Welles, I saw an interview with Orson Welles and Peter Bogdanovich, where Welles more or less said similar things, saying, after all, the Renaissance had a finite period.
Yeah.
Expect movies to last forever.
Yeah. No, I agree with that.
Well, and if you want to get strict about it, movies have been dying since about 1946. That was the peak year for movie going in this country. That was still, I believe, that holds a record for the largest number of people who went to the movies. And there are a lot of statistics now that seem increasingly sort of altered to make it seem like the industry is healthier than it is. And I was trying to find out, I was looking up the number of screens now versus, 20 years ago, and it was about the same or a little more. But then I tried to find information on how big were the screens and how big were the auditoriums, how many seats were in the auditoriums. Because if you have 100 screens and each of them is a minimum of 200 seats and some of them are as big as 800, and then you flash forward to the modern era when it's extremely rare to see a theater that has 800 seats in it, the more likely it's going to be between 40 and maybe 200 and maybe on the high end 400. That changes the picture a lot. And the stadium, so-called stadium seating, the restaurant style theaters, all of those have fewer seats. And I went to visit the Inwood Theater in Dallas, which is a beautiful Art Deco theater from the 1930s. And I worked there in college, and I spent a lot of my life there, a lot. And saw a lot of great movies there. And that was an art house and independent cinema for a long time. And it's recently, it's still in existence. Yay, I'm glad. But it's showing first-run movies. And I took my two kids there, just a nostalgia trip. Like, you want to see where Dad worked during college? And they were playing Spider-Man on 2 screens and Toy Story 4 on the other one. And, whatever one may say about the quality of those movies, I was a little sad because when I started working there, the 3 movies that were playing were The Cook, the Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover, Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, and Cinema Paradiso. Vastly more interesting than what you can see at the Inwood now.
Really?
know,
Oh, come on. Not those.
There's the Armond I love.
Oh,
well,
I take the point. I take your point, though.
Can I just say a word about Armond?
please.
I get into fights about you to this day, Armond, and I always just lead off. I'm like, I don't want to get into it with you right now, but all I'm going to say is this guy. I don't think there's ever been another major critic in the history of the United States who wrote simultaneously for the National Review and Out. So some respect, please.
What can I tell you?
Some respect, please.
That's right. There we go.
I do want to kind of close on this this idea of your camaraderie. I mean, you worked together at New York Press decades ago. Your time spans kind of varied. Matt, I forgot. Were you the last? You're the youngest. Were you the last to join, or was Armond?
No, Armond was. I came on in '95, and Armond joined in '97, and then Godfrey left. They eliminated Godfrey's position in 2000, and then I left in 2006 after a personal tragedy, and Armond was the last man standing. And it got to the point where Armond was the biggest marquee name that they had, and they were putting him on the cover, and they were putting him in opposition to like whatever filmmaker he was painting that week, like it was Godzilla versus Megalon. It was a very strange time.
That's me and Will Smith versus Will Smith.
Right, that's what it was. Yeah.
So we're. Do you still?
Can I add something? I think.
Sure, please.
Let's not forget, because I don't think this has been mentioned publicly before, and it's something that I know that we all three of us are grateful for our opportunity at New York Press, and the troika that existed in 2000 was the envy of this town, fellows. And
yeah.
that is proven by the fact that it was in 2000 that the New York Times decided to expand its first string critics position to 3. Why 3? Because they envied what we had accomplished.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And New York Press was the publication that forced the Village Voice to go free. The Village Voice was the last alternative weekly in the United States to have paid circulation. And that was possible in part because New York had a newsstand on every corner, so they could, get it. But they lost so much advertising due to New York Press coming on very strong and being such an appealing paper that a few years down the road they had to go free themselves, and it was totally due to New York Press.
Yay, we won!
You're not allowed to say his name in public anymore, but Woody Allen in Love and Death, I love when he says they're about to go into battle against the French, and the guy says, "Here's what's going to happen. If we kill more Frenchmen, we win, and if they kill more Russians, they win." And Fielding Mellish raises his hand, and goes, "What do we win?"
Well,
yeah,
exactly. I just on this point of camaraderie, because you guys did make a name for yourself back in the day at New York Press. I'm curious as to how your friendship has survived or thrived in the decades since. Do you still keep in regular touch, or is it just kind of keeping up with what everybody's writing?
Wait a minute, I want to add something to what Matt just said.
Okay.
We won the valor of the moment that this book preserves. That's what we won.
I find it very strange that you're the most Frank Capra of the three of us right now.
No, not Capra. You call me Altman. But that's. I mean, it's a good Woody Allen joke, but it does not apply here. We won the valor of the moment. Do you think somebody wants to read a book of those 3 New York Times critics? We won it, Matt. But wear the victory with grace.
Okay, I will. I'm wearing it. I'm wearing it right now.
Okay.
It just says Duke Ellington. So
well, that's graceful.
Ian, one thing is that Matt became editor at RogerEbert.com after Roger passed, and his widow Chaz decided to keep the site as a active site with various critics, and Matt became the editor-in-chief there, and he brought me on board. So Matt and I have maintained our friendship along with a working relationship for the last several years due to that. And, I'm always happy to run into Armond or see him or read something that he writes. So that's another part of it. And definitely the friendship between the three of us has continued on despite whatever vicissitudes have come since we left New York Press.
I always felt very close to these two guys. I really did. And they were very important to me, to my development as a critic. And they were constantly introducing me to things that I wasn't familiar with, recommending filmmakers that I hadn't seen very many of their films. And Godfrey certainly turned me on to independent cinema. Armond was constantly suggesting things from deeper in the past of movies when I would be enamored with something that had just come out and said, wow, that feels really new. And it would usually be Armond who would say, like, nah, somebody else did it in 1943. Here's the name of the movie. You should go see it. And, I love that. And also, even though we took shots at each other, in print sometimes and even at screenings. I remember Armond coming over to me after I wrote a rave review of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. We were at a screening of something else a few days later, and he came walking over to me, and without even saying hello, he goes, I read your review. I guess you drank the Kool-Aid. And I loved that. And people would ask me, like, what's your relationship like with these guys? I'm like, do you remember that Warner Brothers cartoon with the sheepdog and the wolf? Where they go punch in the morning. It's like, morning, Sam, morning, Ralph. And then they try to kill each other, for the next 12 hours. And then they punch out and they're like, good night, Sam, good night, Ralph. That's what it was like. Like, we had a role. And I say that in the sense of, a duty, but also in sense of a performance that we carried out in print in service of what we thought was the profession. But off screen, I love these guys. I off the page, I love these guys. And, I had many long phone conversations with both of them that had nothing to do with whatever the assignment was this week. I remember one time I called up, I was watching Siskel and Ebert on TV, and this is when Siskel had returned after he'd had brain surgery. Siskel had returned to Siskel and Ebert after he'd had surgery to remove the tumor, and I had a long conversation with Armond about the ethics of putting the guy on TV when he couldn't finish a sentence. I remember that, and I remember talking to Godfrey about the beginning of digital projection when he was writing his Death of Film, Decay of Cinema piece, and they gave me ideas all the time. Sometimes they would just give me, they would hand them out like bonbons, and it was like I had a conversation with one of them. I'd get off the phone, and I'd go like, I think I've got a piece out of this. I would try to make sure it wasn't a piece they were writing already. I don't want to steal cheese off another guy's plate if I can help it.
Right. And that's something that does, I think, come across in the book. And it's nice to hear that you're all, not only colleagues, but still friends. I know we were talking a little bit ago, this is when you had to step out for a second, Matt, about, for new generations of film critics, people who want to get into this and do what we do, what's a good starting point? One of the things I think is also very important is to cultivate a relationship with film critics, people that you respect their opinion, who are doing this, for the same kind of passion, really thinking about the art form. Because like what you were saying, Matt, about some of the things that Armond would turn you on to, one of the things I love the most is having conversations with people in the Chicago Film Critics Association or filmmakers I talk to say, oh, have you heard about this filmmaker? Or have you checked out this genre? I'm doing an entire, several month-long series on Italian horror because I hadn't really dug into it. So that's the kind of thing I think makes film criticism special, not only just as sort of, it's not just film advocacy, go see this movie, don't go see this movie, here's why you should look into this, here's why these things are worth talking about and appreciating as an art form. I think there's an art to film criticism as well. So yeah, I think the Press Gang is a beautiful, not only a time capsule of a great bygone era with some wonderfully prescient statements about where we're at now. It's also kind of almost like a bromance of three very talented film critics doing some of the best work of their lives. So thank you very much for participating in this book. Thank you very much for participating in this conversation. This has been a real treat, despite some technical issues. I apologize for that.
Thank you
for the invitation, Ian.
All right. Well, take care, gentlemen, and the best of luck to you.